Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for, I don't know whether you were in here unintentionally for lunch, but you've unwittingly wandered into one of my sessions. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Patrick Watson. I'm Director of Research at Cavell, and I wanted to take you through sort of some of our research around driving go-to-market success across different markets. And I meant by different markets, I took a really broad interpretation to this presentation, just so I could cram in as much research as possible. And feel free to shout any questions from the audience as we sort of go through. So I wanted to take you through some of the sort of key highlights from a little bit of research. First of all, I thought I'd go global market sizing. Big numbers always, tend to sort of intrigue people. So at Cavell, Matt was talking about this morning, we started initially looking at VoIP market within the UK, and we expanded out into European markets, looking at the SIP market and the VoIP market in Europe, and then we expanded into North America, and then we got questions primarily about English-speaking markets as a sort of expansion point. South Africa, Australia, where we launched our APAC event, and now, actually, we cover data in more than 200 countries around the world. So if any, and I think I've said this every year, this joke, and it's never got better, if anyone wants to go with me to Bermuda to count the number of seats that are there, number of fixed-line seats, I'm more than happy to do that if you expense the trip. So, and then we can see how accurate or otherwise the data is for Bermuda. So we track more than 450 million business telephony users globally. Now, when I say business telephony users, those are users who are using either a fixed line or a mobile solution specifically for a business proposition, so not consumer. So more than 450 million globally. We segregate those across different markets. So, and again here, it depends what countries you put inside the different brackets. So, for example, Australia, New Zealand, East and Southeast Asia, we count as 130 million users. How much of the Chinese market do you count in that? Is a really good question. We don't count the Indian market in that, for example, so there are some real clarifications there in terms of the exact definitions. But that was the market we looked at most recently in terms of Australia, New Zealand, East and Southeast Asia. The North American market, more than 104 million business telephony users. And the European market, again, depending, do you count Russia inside that? How far do you go into Eastern Europe? More than 120 million business telephony users. Those are the base business telephony users. So we also look at what is the penetration of that user base that uses cloud-based technologies. And again, we're specific with our definitions on this in terms of you have to be using a publicly hosted multi-tenant PBX or UCaaS solution in order for it to be cloud. And roughly, global penetration, around 20% of that number. In a lot of these markets that we're looking at, particularly emerging markets, you look at the African market, very, very little in terms of cloud penetration. The Australian market, which we looked at recently, actually pretty high levels of penetration, and the number of cloud users in Australia is actually comparable to the number of cloud users in France, despite it having half the population, purely because adoption in Australia has been higher than what we've seen in continental Europe. So there's a couple of really interesting things that I just wanted to sort of highlight before I move on from this. We've been looking at a lot of emerging markets in particular detail. So if you look at markets like South Africa, if you look at markets like Turkey, a lot of the Eastern European markets that I was talking about before, Poland, and a lot of the Middle Eastern markets are actually seeing relatively accelerated cloud growth rates. And the way we get all this data is from anonymized feedback from service providers in the market. So we try and find service providers within Saudi Arabia or within the UAE, speak to them and get some anonymized data to understand how the market's gone. That's how we've done it in every other market. And generally, we're actually seeing some really good cloud growth rate in those markets. So first thing I wanted to highlight is there is a huge global opportunity and this is cloud UCaaS. I know we talked a lot in the panels this morning about you can't look at a siloed cloud telephony proposition or a siloed PBX system, but there's still a huge volume of users out there, more than 300 million, who are probably going to move to cloud over the next few years, because we think roughly 90% of the market will go. So, in terms of looking at the different paths to success, so there's that huge global market there in terms of number of seats. All of that obviously represents a bottom line revenue number. That's what everyone's ultimately interested in. How do you leverage that in terms of succeeding within the market? So what I wanted to talk about really quickly here was go-to-market evolution and what we're seeing in the models. And Tom and I, who's in the audience here, who's leading our UC research, we've done, over the last sort of 4 to 6 weeks, we've done interviews with about 50 of the market's leading providers. We've surveyed nearly 100 providers in the market. And one of the things that is changing more than anything else is the go-to-market and the channel model. Not only what routes you take to market, what channels you take to market, but also what commercial models do you use through those different routes? So they were talking about it on the panels this morning. You know, is it an agency model? Is it a resale model? All of those come into questions, and all of those have preferences within different areas. Different markets have different preferences for different channel models. I think one of the key things that I sort of wanted to highlight here was generally when we talk to providers about why they're doing this, why they're exploring their channel options, first of all, there's risk mitigation. If you purely have a direct sales play, if you have any sort of problems with that, you are very isolated in that. In terms of diversifying yourself and having multiple options, it's a good idea to diversify those go-to-market routes for you. As I said, different countries vary dramatically. We see a much higher preference generally in the US for what you'd call an agency model as opposed to Europe. However, in the research that we were doing recently, as we're seeing more complex communication solutions taken up within the European market, actually we're seeing sort of increased demand for agency models in places like the UK and Germany, where previously they weren't quite as popular as they have been in the US. And I think the final thing that's really interesting to this, we've spoken to a number of providers, and I won't name the providers, about their go-to-market plans around Europe. And one of the providers in particular told us, we are going to sign 2,000 partners to sell our converged UC and CC proposition. And we said to them, there aren't 2,000 partners who can sell combined UC and CC in Europe. And that is one of the really key things. Does the channel have the skill set to sell a particular proposition within market? It was talked about on all of the panels this morning. That is one of the sort of biggest challenges I think that we're facing in the market in terms of if you're a vendor or if you're a service provider, do you either have the skill set or can you help your channel equip themselves with the skill set to sell a particular solution? So it's all very well saying we're going to sign X number of partners. Are there X number of partners out there? And also, those partners are in incredibly high demand. If you're a partner with lots of PS and MS skills in particular areas, all of those indirect providers are going to want to go after you because you've got that skill set and you can bring in that customer base. So, a number of challenges around sort of go-to-market evolution.
Patrick, do we let us questions?
Oh, do we go in questions all the way through? Go on then. Sam, you can go first, and then we'll go Paul.
Okay. Is that number of partners in Europe increasing or decreasing?
Well, and allow me to stop stumbling there. In our Channel Insights tool, we track an increase in providers. That's partly because we have a platform called Channel Insights where we track the number of channel partners. However, generally, Sam, we see convergence and M&A and consolidation, so that number will decrease. But you do get new entrants from different areas. So it would depend completely about what particular bit of the market you're looking at. But generally, contraction over time as there's agglomeration and mergers and acquisitions. Paul, on to you.
Yeah, you had direct digital on your slide, and you never really mentioned it. And you nuanced the fact that complex solutions wouldn't necessarily suit a direct sale, and you talked about skills. So, yeah, why is it on there? Is it real? Are people succeeding in terms of that direct digital play?
There are definitely providers out there, and I think you know well because you've purchased some of them, that do direct sales very well. I think on a complex sales cycle, and it's with something like high-end CCaaS, I don't think anyone is going to be buying that direct online zero touch. It's just not going to happen. Maybe in small volumes, but I don't think it's going to happen. So I think it's important to have it on there because, and when I come to this next slide, as you can see, the majority of providers still in the market, focus on a direct sales channel. That is still the majority take to market. But I think to your point, Paul, it is for more simplistic solution areas rather than that more complex sale. And ultimately, and I know everybody in the room probably is trying to develop that simple sale into a more complex outcome-based sale where you can add loads of additional value. It's where do you add the value in unless it's a really simple transactional requirement, you want to be able to do it at scale. So I wanted to, yes, I wish I'd never opened this question. No, go ahead, please. The more interactive, the better. Go ahead.
European or is that global or European?
So this is global. Yeah, so this is from global data. So this is from interviews we've done with more than 100 providers. And I could break it down on a sort of more granular level, but again, as soon as you start to, it depends how many French providers are in it, that sort of thing. So agency model increasing in popularity. The European markets in particular, very, very dependent on the channel, on that trusted advisor position. And I think definitely, although we are seeing some European providers move to North America, generally the traffic is North American providers come to Europe. Understanding the channel and the nuance of those different European markets has been a real challenge for US providers. And that is something that I think is, really important to understand when you're trying to go out into these new markets in terms of you're going to have local language support. And ultimately, the success we've seen from a lot of over-the-top providers is where they've made acquisition in country and they have local native teams. And they're not even bringing someone in, it's having a local native team in France. If we talk about the Italian market, for example, it was explained to me years ago that it was effectively 2 markets, the north of Italy and the south of Italy. Since then, I've been told it's 6 markets, the sort of north market around Milan, the center of the market, and then the south of Italy is a complete, other ball game with single, user businesses that don't use any telephony systems. So there's incredible nuance in each of those different geographies. And looking in detail at those markets, you can't take a broad brush approach across Europe or across APAC, for example. Vertical market attention. I've heard the phrase hyper-verticalization this morning more times than I think I've heard it in my entire life. So I'm not quite sure what the hyper means. Is it even more increased focus on particular verticals? I'll have to check with Alianza about the hyper piece. But absolutely, vertical market attention. We have had more inquiries at Cavell about vertical specific research over the last 18 months than we have had in the 5 years that I've worked here. And I think it's because of that premise that UC is becoming commoditized, it's slightly homogenized, it's really difficult to differentiate potentially on primarily your UC proposition. How do you do that? You do it by having a really tailored vertical focus. Now, one of the things that Tom and I looked at, and we've got a panel coming up on vertical, so anyone who's interested in that, I urge them to stay here for that. One of the things that we found from the research is 90% of the vendors and service providers that we talked to talked about having a vertical play. So 9 out of 10 providers say, yeah, we've got vertical specialization. If you actually ask them, how many of you have created a bespoke solution which either integrates into specifically or has some capability within a vertical, so it integrates into a particular healthcare system, for example, it was only 46%. So 90% of the market talk about it and market about it, less than half have actually done anything in terms of product. And then we asked a further question, have you got dedicated sales or support or technical teams that specialize in verticals? I think it was 27%. So you're seeing this sort of tiering in terms of what do you mean by saying you're a vertical specialist? Are you just marketing about it? Have you got a case study? Great. Have you developed a specific product for a vertical? Better. Have you got dedicated sales support, technical teams who specialize in that vertical as the sort of top tier? And we're seeing that progression through the tiers. So vertical markets, as I said, panel coming up on that should be really good. But we've got more in questions than that than anything else. I highlighted that I should have said the graph up here is the most common verticals that we get questions about. It tends to be public sector, healthcare, education and finance. Retail often comes up quite high, but didn't on this particular survey. Retail often comes up as well. But again, I think retail, very broad brush. Maybe there's sort of more tailoring you can go to into that. And sort of finally, I just wanted to talk about go-to-market challenges. So again, this comes from the same service provider research. This is from the global research. The biggest challenge we hear about is competition. And when we dive into that in a bit more detail, and I think you heard about it this morning, and we'll hear about it in the CX Summit for anyone who's interested in the customer experience stuff upstairs. The competitive landscape is, and we've talked about this for years, the convergence is the problem. It's providers coming from all of these different areas, and one of the key areas that we're seeing targeted is being talked about upstairs is customer experience. All of the big providers are going after CX because it's where a lot of the value is. And I think Alianza mentioned it this morning. I think the CRM market is increasingly relevant and is going to be, really interesting for a lot of providers in this room in terms of expanding into or integrating into CRM. But that competitive landscape those providers, those hyperscalers are coming into this space and have been, for a number of years, and it's how that competitive landscape sort of transforms in the future. So that's one of the key challenges that providers are facing. Increasingly difficult for product differentiation. And I had my platform panel on here before. I don't know if anyone saw that. I had loads of questions after that about how many platforms are actually available to service providers now. The market's really consolidated. And actually, if we've done some product comparisons across solutions, across communications platforms for service providers. And if you actually look at the platforms, there isn't a huge amount of differentiation. You can drill right down into features and functions and see slightly nuanced differences, but generally, they all have pretty much the same less capability in terms of features and functions. So where the value add is partly within the customer experience and contact center, because the feature sets are more complicated, but also in service and support, all those other areas, price, marketing, go-to-market, vertical focus, all of those areas. And the number 3 on here, I tend to gloss over due to my lack of expertise in it. It would be regulatory and compliance. Always a huge consideration for providers, especially if you're expanding geographic markets. We've done various regulatory projects on the consulting side. We've done bits of research in it. It is a really key consideration if you're looking into different European countries, or if we were looking at the Middle Eastern market in terms of the regulatory landscape, how some of the local governments and the central governments in those Middle Eastern regions mandate what you must and mustn't do with customer data and customer systems. It is incredibly rigorous and also really complicated. So I think those are the sort of key go-to-market challenges that providers are facing within the market. And I've already touched on the sort of last point I made up here in terms of partner identification and sort of acquisition. I think that is, a real battleground and absolutely critical for everyone in the market. That is pretty much everything from me. I've left this feedback slide up here. You will actually get a post-event survey anyway, so you don't have to fill this in. You can only scan the QR code if the feedback is positive for this session. If not, then don't bother. Absolute pleasure. Sam, question, please, go ahead.
So I figure your feedback.
No.
So this morning, Matt showed that chart that said the larger companies are really interested in security and AI.
Yeah.
How do you rectify that with your comments on verticalization, partner specialties, et cetera? Is there a way you can get this all to mix together in a soup you can make sense of?
Yeah, definitely, Sam. We'll take that offline. No, there absolutely is, and I think what Matt showed this morning was that is the top strategic goals of a survey of a couple of thousand businesses. So you have to look at that in terms of what we've seen is as AI rises in importance, generally in larger businesses, we've seen this correlation with an increased focus on data security and data sovereignty. Smaller businesses, the key cost, and we were talking about it only the other day on a call, the key strategic concern is still cost. Every enterprise survey we do, it always comes back at cost. So there's ways of looking at it throughout the piece, but I think if you look at Weave, for example, in the US, for an example, have you heard of Weave? So this is a US-based and completely direct sales. I think we've talked to you about it as well. Yeah, dentist office in a box, and they effectively, it's completely online, and they only market to specific verticals. Primarily, I think they said they've got like 50% market share in dental surgeries in the US. So that is an example of both focusing on small businesses and hitting a vertical requirement. I mean, it's an example that I've used 95 times now. I'll have to come up with some other ones, but yeah. So any other feedback? If it's good, please submit.